The national security strategy of the Trump administration has come up with the Trump corollary: active interventionism, gunboat diplomacy, economic nationalism. And now, of course, America has ended up in war. Many of our readers have asked me, what is the Dondro Doctrine? And so I'm going to take a stab at unraveling it for you. Hello, I'm Atul Singh, founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. We are one of the few nonprofits in the world news space, and we try to explain politics, geopolitics, foreign policy, and more to you. To make sense of the world, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel and sign up to our newsletter. Today, I'll be explaining the Dondro Doctrine. So, if you go back to November 2025, the National Security Strategy of the United States of America came out. And it said that a top priority would be to ensure a reasonably stable and well-governed Western Hemisphere. Why? Because the US does not want mass migration. It wants to ensure border security. So what does this entail? It entails governments in Western Hemisphere cooperate with narco-terrorists, or cooperate against, I stand corrected, cooperate against narco-terrorist cartels and other transnational criminal organizations. The region should be free of hostile foreign incursion or foreign ownership of key assets. This is very important because this has major ramifications going forward. The Western Hemisphere supports critical supply chains, and it gives continued access to the US to key strategic locations. And the National Security Strategy said, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this is also known as the Dondro Doctrine. To understand the Dondro Doctrine, however, we have to go back to the Monroe Doctrine. The Dondro Doctrine is named after US President Donald Trump. And the Monroe Doctrine is named after a certain president called James Monroe. And this goes back over 200 years. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization. So what does that mean? It means that European countries couldn't come and take over Brazil or Argentina or Chile. In his address to the US Congress, Monroe outlined three tenets that came to define American foreign policy for the coming years. Number one, non-colonization. The American continents were to remain free of European imperial control. Number two spheres: Europe, the land of monarchies; America, or Americas, the land of republics. Europe was the old world where kings and queens and czars and kaisers reigned. There wasn't a kaiser yet, but you get the point. And Americas were the place where you'd have democracy and republics. So, hey-ho, there we go. The third thing, which is important, is non-intervention. America promised not to interfere in the internal matters either of European colonies or indeed of European nations. Now, why is that important? Because the French had been trying to export revolution. And America said, look, we are not like the French. We won't export revolution. We are different. You can trust us. We can have a deal, a good deal, the art of the deal, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, so moving swiftly on, why did James Monroe come up with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823? Why not, say, another president at another time? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to the revolutions. And of course, we have to begin with the American Revolution itself. 1776, America declares independence and then, of course, fights a war with Great Britain, achieves independence with French support. And of course, the French go bankrupt in supporting the Americans, And in 1789, they have their own revolution. And of course, there is the reign of terror, there's chaos. And in the aftermath of the chaos emerges a charismatic military leader. His name is Napoleon. By 1799, he has taken charge. In 1804, he's declared himself emperor. And in 1808, this emperor has invaded Spain. So now Spain is under French thumb, and all the Spanish colonies in the Americas start declaring independence. And between 1808, I have a lot of notes for this video, so between 1808 and 1826, except for Cuba and Puerto Rico, all Spanish colonies gain independence. By the way, so does the Portuguese colony of Brazil in 1822. So when Monroe is declaring his doctrine, his Monroe Doctrine, he's seizing upon a fantastic opportunity for America. This is a time when the European continental powers are weak. This is a time when America is rising. This is a time when he can declare the Americas to be the backwater or the background, or the garden, the idyllic garden of the United States. Anyway, long story short, the 3 centuries of Spanish and Portuguese rule come to an end. The US clearly does not want Portugal or Spain to come back. It also does not want France to get any ideas and try and gain colonies. Note, this is a time of Russian expansion. So you have Russian control of Alaska. Russia also has an outpost in Fort Ross in Sonoma County, California. So there is real fear of the Russians taking over a chunk of the Americas. It seems the fear of Russians never goes away. And so to keep the Europeans out, that is a top priority of the Monroe Doctrine. Second, we have to remember that, and this is important, is that this is a time of manifest destiny. This is a time of American expansionism. This is a time when American expansionism is coming against expansionism of other European countries. Now, with Spain out, America has a massive opportunity. Similarly, America has to curtail Russia, because, of course, 2 countries dashed to the Pacific. The Russians dashed in the 18th century, the Americans in the 19th century. The Americans had manifest destiny, and the Russians had their Siberian conquest and quest for overseas colonies. Alaska arguably was one of them. So the third point, following on from this, is that the British, it was the British who had suggested a joint declaration, but Secretary of State and later President John Quincy Adams, son of a president, one of the only 2 people who managed to succeed his father to the top job. George W. Bush succeeded George Herbert Walker Bush. He was the second one, and I believe there was more than 1.5 centuries that elapsed between this phenomenon. James Quincy Adams, who had grown up in Europe, who had been ambassador to Russia, had been around Europe, he was the primary architect of the Monroe Doctrine. And he argued that the US should act alone so as to not look like a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. So, interestingly, a little known fact is that the Monroe Doctrine initially was largely a bluff and was actually enforced by the British Royal Navy. So in 1833, when the US takes over Falkland Islands, the UK takes over Falkland Islands, the US doesn't really say much. But remember, as I said, the US is rising in power. And as US rises in power, so does its assertion of the Monroe Doctrine. And in 1840s, James K. Polk warns Britain not to establish footholds in Oregon and California. He also warns Spain not to do any hanky-panky in Mexico's Yucatan. And of course, under James Polk, in 1845, the US takes over Texas, 1846 to 48, there is the US-Mexico War. Mexico loses 50% of its territory. US gains Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, and Nevada. So James Skip Oak has dramatically expanded the US. Of course, this is followed by the Civil War, but after the end of the Civil War, in 1867, not only does the US acquire Alaska, but also the US pressures France to withdraw its puppet kingdom from Mexico. And the US continues growing in power. By 1898, you get the Spanish-American War. Spain obviously loses and loses badly, and soon you have Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines under American control, and Cuba becomes an American protectorate. So you're starting to see a more assertive America, and America certainly in control of the key assets of Latin America. And by this time, Latin America is already becoming an exporter of commodities, not so much to Europe, but to America, which is industrializing and industrializing fast. So all industrial powers need commodities, and these commodities they convert into finished goods. And so it is very important for the US to have primacy over Latin America. At this time, remember that France has its African empire, North African empire. The British have their empire all the way from Canada to New Zealand. They control the Suez Canal, they control Iran, Iraq, obviously India, which is the jewel in the crown. And the British have plenty of raw materials and plenty of markets for finished goods. And America is just starting to get going. And guess what? As America starts to get going, one of its greatest presidents, President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, adds the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904. Now, this is supremely important because this says that in case of a flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American country, the US could intervene in that Latin country's or Latin American country's internal affairs. This is part of his big stick policy, and he regards the US domination of the Western Hemisphere as a moral imperative. Now, importantly, Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt corollary sets the tone for American action in Latin America for the next century, almost a century. So you see America intervening. The term banana republics comes into being. Why? Because for cheap bananas, you overthrow the rulers of any particular country. Once you get to the end of World War II, then the left becomes attractive to many of these unequal Latin American countries. And then, of course, America backs a lot of military dictatorships to curb the spread of communism. Of course, Cuba falls, and Cuba remains an eyesore for the US till today. But on the whole, America manages to hold the tide. And yes, some of it is like the making of sausages. Operation Condor is infamous till today. That is where you see military dictatorships engaging in human rights abuses, undocumented killings, thousands disappearing, thousands dying, and very repressive systems. But by 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and then you get the democratization of Latin America. America is not feeling so threatened, and America does not engage in supporting military dictatorships anymore, and everything seems to be going fine. But new problems emerge. From 1991, China starts trading more and more with Latin America, and after 2001, China's trade increases exponentially with Latin America. America is deindustrializing, China is industrializing, so China now becomes the key market for Latin American commodities. And I will just give you an example of China-Brazil trade, because that is important. That sums up what is going on. And China-Brazil trade goes up 50-fold, over 50-fold. It is 3.2 billion in 2001, and it rises to 158 billion in 2024. This is staggering. So the Chinese are now gobbling up soybeans, Brazilian soybeans, cotton, sugar, beef, wood, oil, iron ore. And today in Brazil, BYD, which is an electric car company, those in America know about Tesla, and very few know about BYD. But BYD now controls 74% of Brazil's electric vehicle market. So this tells you how the rise of China in America's backyard starts making people in Washington, policymakers in Washington, increasingly nervous. It's the same nervousness that came when the Soviet Union was strengthening its relations with Latin America. Now, that was more ideological, and this is more economic. Now, to counter this, the national security strategy of the Trump administration has come up with the Trump corollary. And it has three pillars. Active interventionism, meaning you intervene actively, you sink boats, drug boats, you put pressure, you take economic actions. Number two, gunboat diplomacy, best demonstrated by sending ships over to get Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro back here in chains. And number three, economic nationalism, pushing Latin American countries to export more to the US, especially when it comes to critical minerals, as they say early on in the national security strategy. And that is very much, part of the Trump corollary. Now, it has also led to threats against Colombia and Mexico, including threats of military strikes. The US is putting pressure on Panama because it wants Panama Canal completely under US control, or directly or indirectly, and wants the Chinese out. The US has given a $20 billion bailout to Argentina, where President Javier Milei is an ideological ally of President Donald Trump. He is certainly a libertarian and very much in keeping very much in line with the philosophy of the administration. He also wants to ally more with Israel and America and the West than export to China. There are new sanctions on Nicaragua. There are tightened restrictions on Cuba. And this is where Secretary of State Marco Rubio takes a personal interest, because he is Cuban American. So the Cuban policy we hear is largely Marco Rubio's policy. He is the driving force. He has a family vendetta to settle, or so. I'm being facetious, but the reality is Cuban Americans who've come from Cuba have a visceral dislike of the communist regime, and therefore they are very interested and invested in the fall of communism in Cuba. And of course, you can argue that all this talk about assimilating Canada into the United States and taking over Greenland are also a part of the Dondro Doctrine, or in other words, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, will this doctrine succeed? Well, in some ways, it already has. America has control over Venezuelan oil. America reportedly bribed Delcy Rodriguez $100 million and has control over Venezuela indirectly. As some military officers said, that we have a gun to Delcy's head, and very much now Delcy answers to Washington and not to Beijing. So you could say that America has succeeded. America also probably will control Guyana's oil reserves. So the talk of a petro reset, wherein you get a supply side shock by controlling petroleum reserves, that is certainly the case. Certainly critical minerals, yes, some of them, but there's a fly in the ointment. America can certainly control the smaller countries of South America / Latin America more easily, or anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That is certainly the case. But when it comes to Canada, Mark Carney is unlikely to play ball. In fact, his speech in Davos talked about rupture, that the old order was dead. And so Canada would be very difficult to A, control, and B, forget about assimilate. Physically, militarily, it may be impossible. It's too big. It has too many resources. Similarly, Brazil is not going to abandon its economic relationship with China. Even if, let's say, Bolsonaro's son won tomorrow. Bolsonaro is the right-wing leader, Jair Bolsonaro. And of course, Lula, the current president, is left-leaning. But even if you had a right-leaning government, Brazilian beef would suddenly not be bought here because the Midwest can produce plenty of beef, and so can Texas. Similarly, Brazilian soybeans do not have a market in America. Brazilian soybeans will inevitably go to China, and so on and so forth. So changing the economic trends, changing the economic tidal waves is not as easy as controlling smaller countries. And finally, for all the talk of the Dondro Doctrine and the focus on the Western Hemisphere, or for that matter, Barack Obama's Asia pivot. There was a talk of the Asia pivot earlier that, yes, America would look at Asia. The focus henceforth would be China, which is the big challenger. It is something that this administration agrees to as well. China is the biggest challenger to the United States ever in its history. And given that, given all that talk, it is yet again amusing to see America trapped in the Middle East. America ended up in the quagmire of Middle Eastern sands for 20 years after 9/11, after the September 11, 2001 attacks. America first went into Afghanistan, which is not quite the Middle East, and then ended up in Iraq, which was, shall we say, unwise. And now, of course, America has ended up in war with Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz is closed. We have a Hormuz crisis, and we have a supply side shock to the global economy that is bigger than 1973, that is certainly bigger than 1979. And that has ensured that the US now very much cannot just look at the Western Hemisphere. And the Donroe Doctrine, while attractive, while seductive, might yet have to wait.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.